Well, ingredients-wise, beer is quite simple. All you really need is water, malted barley, hops, and yeast. That's all you really need to do to make great beer.
So yeah, the 4 ingredients: hops, malted barley, yeast, and water. It starts with the ale yeast and the lager yeast. There's only 2 types of yeast. And ales are generally more robust, or I'd say they're more robust, more flavorful. And lagers are generally more, we call them sessionable, drinkable. But you can really manipulate either styles to do whatever you want these days.
But basically what you do is you take your malted barley and you extract all the sugars out of it in this thing called a mash.
Mash paddle. It's a small version. Use this to stir.
During the mash, most of the enzymes in the barley go to work, breaking down all the long polymers of starch into smaller sugars that can actually be fermented.
To finish the boiling, you extract all the sugars from the grain, and you got wort, which is basically a barley type of tea. Yeah, you take that wort and you put it into the fermentation tanks. And the fermentation tanks, depending upon what kind of beer you're making, whether it's an ale or lager, will be cold or warm. Lagers are fermented at cold temperatures. Ales are fermented at warmer temperatures. So then you'll inoculate the wort with yeast, depending upon what kind of beer you're making. You'll use ale yeast or lager yeast, and there's different yeast within those categories as well.
Once you have your wort, you put it into the process called the boil. The boil is basically where you add your hops, and the hops basically contribute flavor, aroma, and that bitterness that's custom to most of the beers that we're familiar with today.
And then the yeast will start eating the sugars and creating alcohol and CO2. And from there, you're going to finish your beer. After the fermentation process has happened, you'll start lagering your beer. So we'll show you the lager room next, which will be in a cold cellar room, and that's where the beer will finish up. It'll finish its carbonation process and it'll start to settle.
So lagers tend to be what's called like a bottom fermenting beer. They take a little bit longer to brew. They're done like colder weather, stuff like that. So like back in the olden days, they found that when they took their beer and put it in like caves, like ice caves and stuff like that, by the end of the winter time, it had stored and ended up like continuing the fermentation process, and it ended up being like a clear, like more cleaner beer.
This is just a modern version of like a cellar. It's just a cold box where we keep it at about 40 degrees or so, sometimes a little cooler. And it's where all of our beer finishes. So finishes its carbonation in here. It's pretty much done fermenting at the time, and there's just still a little bit slow fermentation process happening. And then if it doesn't have enough carbonation, we can enter a secondary fermentation process with adding more wort into the beer. The yeast will activate again and start eating more sugars. Or we can force carbonate by injecting CO2 into the tanks, and then the beer will absorb the CO2 over time.
So my first batch, it was an extract kit. I didn't go from an all-grain approach, but after I was done with it, I stuck it in the fermenter, or the carboy as we like to refer to it, and over I think 3 days I saw the yeast going to work. They were eating up all the sugars, making the beer, but what I didn't realize was that I overfilled my carboy, and one morning I woke up and all my beer had exploded all over my kitchen, and regardless to say, my mom was pretty pissed off at me. If you're looking for a really interesting beer, you can stray away from the standard pitching of your yeast and go into what's called a wild fermentation.
there are now more and more trends that are happening and becoming popular, where you are injecting bacteria or whatnot into your beer, and you're getting souring components, things of that nature. And it's been done for a long time. It just now people are looking for different varieties of beer, so sour beers become more popular. We got a couple barrels of beer, wine barrels, whiskey barrels that have kind of taken on bacteria from the barrel or wild yeast and have a little bit of a sour component to them.
Where wild yeast that basically is present in the brewery naturally inoculates your beer, and it ferments that way. These kind of beers give pretty fruity notes. People actually refer to natural yeast strains such as Brettanomyces of giving a Band-Aidy or horse blanket flavor that actually some wines have in them.
Creek beers, Flemish, red beers, there's a lot of different styles of beer that have a souring component to it. Yeah. And that's what it comes from. It comes from bacteria being put into the brewing process at different times and creates a sour component. And there's even other beers that develop in the same manner as accidents, like make a Doppelbock for the wintertime, which is a beer that came about due to the German monks. They were brewing a beer that was a little more robust, had some more grain in it, so they figured that a more robust beer they could sustain themselves off of during fasting. So during the Lent season or during the Advent season or Christmas and stuff, they wouldn't eat, so they would consume beer instead. And so they would brew a stronger beer with more grain and stuff, supposedly more nutrition, and then they added to these Doppelbock beers or just Bock beers that came out over the holiday seasons, and also in the springtime they do the same for the Lent season. So that transitioned to a bartender, I think, having a beer in the back during wintertime, and the beer froze, and all that was left over was all the alcohol that was left, and that got poured off because he had no more beer to pour for his patrons, and it turned into an ice bock. So now you see a style called an ice bock, which just came because of an accident, some person putting their keg outside or the barrel of beer outside, needing beer, but it was frozen. All that was left over was the beer that had the most alcohol in it. So that's another style that came out of kind of accidentally. So people, sometimes mistakes turn into or traditions that turn into new styles of beer.
Really it is. If you go from an extract approach, it's really as simple as boiling a pot of water, adding a little bit of sugar to it, not a little bit of sugar, sorry, I should clarify, a lot of sugar, and basically adding hops after that, and then throwing it into a fermenter, letting it sit for a while and become beer.
I don't think much, just need something to boil, some water on for it to get to the right temperatures and transfer it into to another container to ferment it in and keep it at a steady temperature. So definitely it's quite easy to make beer. Get the beer how you want it to taste and have it taste like that every time you make it. That's the tricky part. But just make a beer is not too complicated.
And makes the finished product that we all love.
I'm the day bartender at the Early Bird Saloon, and from 6 o'clock to noon I pour breakfast for the soaks who can't hold a fork and spoon. I take ham and scrambled egg, then I draw one from the keg and mix them in the blender. I'm the day bartender.